Tulsi Gabbard walked into that Senate hearing room on the morning of February 6, 2025, knowing exactly what was waiting for her. She had read every op-ed. She had cataloged every tweet. She had watched Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez on 3 separate cable news appearances calling her unfit, dangerous, a traitor wrapped in a uniform. 5.8 million Twitter followers sending daily hate. Progressive blogs writing think pieces about her alleged Russian sympathies. Activist groups organizing protests outside her confirmation hearings. And at the center of all of it, one congresswoman from the Bronx who had appointed herself judge, jury, and executioner of Tulsi Gabbard's entire record of service. AOC had built the campaign against her nomination with the same precision she used for everything. Carefully worded statements, coordinated social media attacks, emotional testimony designed to make Tulsi look dangerous to democracy itself. It had been theatrical, it had been viral, and it had been almost entirely without evidence. What Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez did not understand, what she could not have known, was that the woman she'd spent months attacking had spent those same months doing something AOC had never once done in her life. Preparing, not for a social media moment, not for a viral clip, preparing the way a soldier prepares before a mission. Quietly, thoroughly, without a single post about it. Because when Tulsi Gabbard finally responded, she wasn't going to perform. She was going to destroy. And the destruction would be complete, documented, and permanent. Before we go inside that hearing room and watch one of the most extraordinary political moments in modern American history, smash that like button right now. Because what you are about to witness is not political theater. It is something far rarer. It is a warrior. A decorated combat veteran with 21 years of military service, dismantling a social media politician who thought a following was the same thing as authority. Subscribe to this channel immediately because we are committed to showing you what real accountability looks like when performance meets substance and loses. The morning of February 6, 2025 arrived in Washington with the kind of cold that cuts through wool coats and makes the marble steps of federal buildings look like something from a war photograph. Gray sky pressed down over the Senate chambers. Security personnel moved in practiced formations. Camera crews staked out positions. Journalists compared notes in doorways, breath clouding in the February air, all of them sensing that something unusual was about to happen. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had arrived 90 minutes early. She was not scheduled to testify. She was there as a member of the public record, seated in the gallery above the Senate Intelligence Committee chambers, watching the confirmation hearings for Tulsi Gabbard as the nominee for Director of National Intelligence. Her communications team had prepared her extensively. She had 3 separate statements ready, each calibrated for a different scenario. She had talking points about Russia. She had data on Tulsi's past television appearances. She had quotes from foreign policy analysts who questioned Gabbard's worldview. And she had her phone, fully charged, with a social media strategy planned down to the minute, including the exact moment to post and the exact language to use to generate maximum engagement. In the green room adjacent to the hearing chamber, one of her aides was refreshing Twitter every 30 seconds. They were expecting fireworks. They were not expecting what actually happened. AOC sat in the gallery in a dark blazer that she'd chosen carefully because it photographed well in formal settings. She'd done her makeup herself that morning, which she only did when she wanted it to look effortless rather than professional. Every detail was intentional. She understood cameras the way a theater director understands lighting. She knew which angles made her look authoritative and which made her look too young, too Brooklyn, too far from the levers of power she pretended to distrust. She had pulled her hair back, another deliberate choice that said serious and focus rather than the more casual styles she used for Instagram. She was performing seriousness. She was always performing something. As she waited, she scrolled through her mentions. A post she'd made the previous evening had accumulated over 90,000 likes in 12 hours. It read, "Tulsi Gabbard has spent years cozying up to dictators and appearing on state-sponsored propaganda channels. The American people deserve a director of national intelligence who has actually defended American values, not someone who has undermined them at every turn." The response from her base had been electric. The hashtag TulsiUnfit had climbed to number 3 on trending. Progressive media personalities had shared her statement approvingly. Donations to progressive PACs had spiked. She knew, watching those numbers climb, that she was building the narrative correctly. She had done this before. Targeted a figure, applied sustained media pressure, watched the target buckle. It always worked. She had no reason to believe today would be different. What she could not see, and would not see until it was too late, was the folder sitting on the witness table in the Senate chamber 3 floors below. A plain manila folder, unremarkable in appearance, containing documents that had been gathered over 6 weeks of methodical research. Not classified intelligence, not surveillance, just public records, ethics filings, House disbursement reports, financial disclosures, and a timeline so precise and so damning that it had made Tulsi's senior advisor go pale when he reviewed it. Because Tulsi Gabbard had been preparing not just to defend herself, she had been preparing to go on offense. And she had found things about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez that AOC had counted on nobody ever organizing into a single coherent picture. Tulsi herself sat in a small anteroom near the chamber entrance. No phone in hand, no aides buzzing around her with last-minute talking points. She sat alone with the posture of someone who had learned, in actual combat zones, the profound strategic value of stillness. Her dress uniform was pressed with military precision. Every decoration placed exactly where it belonged. The combat medical badge on her left breast pocket, an award that cannot be purchased, an award that cannot be performed, an award that is given only to medical personnel who have provided care under direct enemy fire. She had earned it in Iraq. She had earned it treating soldiers whose blood was on her hands and whose lives depended on her ability to stay calm when chaos erupted around her. She was thinking now about a conversation she'd had 3 weeks earlier with a retired general she respected deeply. He had reviewed the same documents she was carrying into the hearing. He had looked at her over a table in a Georgetown restaurant and said, quietly, "They have no idea what they are dealing with." Tulsi had not responded. She had simply nodded, because she knew it was true. AOC had been attacking a caricature, a media-constructed version of Tulsi Gabbard built from selectively quoted statements and willful mischaracterizations. She had never attacked the real woman. She had never done the research. She had never sat with the actual record. And that, Tulsi had decided, was her fatal mistake. A Senate staffer knocked softly on the anteroom door. "Director-designate Gabbard, we are ready for you." Tulsi rose. She smoothed her jacket with 2 precise downward strokes. She picked up the manila folder, and she walked toward the chamber with the unhurried calm of someone who has already decided how the next several hours are going to end. The Senate Intelligence Committee chamber was formal in the way that Washington does formal. Dark wood paneling, American flags flanking the raised dais where 11 senators sat behind name placards, a single witness table facing them, positioned so that both the committee and the cameras could see the witness clearly. Tulsi took her seat at the witness table. She placed the folder to her right. She poured herself a glass of water from the pitcher provided. Then she folded her hands in front of her and waited. No fidgeting, no glancing at notes, no checking her phone. Just a decorated army officer waiting to be questioned by people who had never worn a uniform and never would, and knowing, with the absolute certainty of someone who has survived actual mortar fire, that she was ready for everything they could bring. Senator Richard Burr opened the proceedings with the standard formalities. He thanked the nominee for appearing. He outlined the committee's concerns. He mentioned the significant questions that had been raised about her suitability for the role. Standard language, bureaucratic throat clearing. Tulsi listened with the patience of someone who has sat through military briefings that lasted 8 hours. Then the questioning began. The first 4 senators were measured. They asked about intelligence community structure, about relationships with allied intelligence agencies, about her views on surveillance law and the balance between security and civil liberties. She answered each question with the precision of someone who had spent months mastering the material. Not political precision, technical precision. She cited statutes. She referenced specific intelligence frameworks. She demonstrated command of material that clearly surprised several of the senators questioning her, because they had expected someone easier to trip up. In the gallery above, AOC watched this with narrowing eyes. This was not going according to the anticipated script. Tulsi was supposed to stumble on technical questions. She was supposed to look out of her depth. Instead, she looked like someone who had done the homework that nobody expected her to do. AOC's aide leaned over and whispered, "She has clearly been briefed extremely well." AOC did not respond. She was thinking. And then Senator Maria Cantwell asked the question that everyone in the room knew was coming. Director-designate Gabbard, members of the public, including several elected officials, have raised concerns about your past statements regarding Russia and specifically your appearances on platforms that some characterize as favorable to the Russian government narrative. Can you address those concerns directly? It was a perfectly constructed opening, broad enough to require a complex answer, specific enough to invoke the most damaging attacks against her, and framed as a legitimate policy concern rather than a political attack. In the gallery, AOC leaned forward slightly. This was the moment. This was where Tulsi was supposed to get defensive, to stumble, to say something that could be clipped and shared. Tulsi looked at Senator Cantwell with an expression that was entirely neutral. She took a slow breath, and then she spoke with the measured authority of someone who had been waiting specifically for this question. "Senator, I want to address those concerns directly and completely, because I think the American people deserve clarity on this rather than the continued distortion of my record for political purposes." Her voice was quiet, controlled, with a quality of absolutely immovable conviction underneath it. "I have been accused of being sympathetic to Russia. I have been accused of appearing on propaganda platforms. I have been called a Russian asset by people who know that accusation is false but calculate that it is useful. And I would like to address each of those accusations with the documented facts, because I have brought those facts here today." She reached out and touched the manila folder. A single deliberate movement, not opening it yet, just making clear it existed. "But before I do that, Senator, I think it is important that this committee and the American people understand what is actually happening here. What is happening is that I am a combat veteran who has questioned the wisdom of certain foreign policy decisions. I have questioned whether endless military intervention produces the outcomes it promises. I have asked uncomfortable questions about how American military power is deployed and whether those deployments serve American national security interests or serve other interests. And when a military veteran with combat experience asks those questions, certain people in Washington become very uncomfortable, because a veteran asking those questions is harder to dismiss than a civilian asking them." She paused. The chamber was completely still. Asking questions about foreign policy is not the same as being an asset of a foreign government. Criticizing specific military actions is not the same as supporting America's adversaries. And appearing on news programs that also air in countries we have complicated relationships with is not the same as producing propaganda. I appeared on programs where I was asked my views. I gave my views honestly. That is what Americans do. It is, in fact, what distinguishes us from the countries whose media systems we criticize. In the gallery, AOC's jaw had tightened. She was calculating. This was a strong answer, stronger than anticipated, but it hadn't addressed the specific accusations yet. She still believed Tulsi would stumble when pressed on the details. Then Tulsi opened the folder. "Senator, I mentioned that I have brought documented facts. I would like to share some of those facts with the committee." She withdrew the first document, holding it at an angle visible to the cameras. "This is a timeline I compiled of every public statement I have made regarding Russia over the past decade. I asked 2 independent researchers to verify it against public records. It shows that I have consistently supported sanctions against Russia for the annexation of Crimea. It shows that I have consistently supported American intelligence community findings regarding Russian interference in American elections. It shows that I have condemned Russian aggression in Ukraine in every public forum where I was asked about it." She placed the document on the table. "The accusations against me are not based on my actual record. They are based on selectively quoted statements stripped of context, and in several cases, on statements attributed to me that I never made." She pulled out a second document. "This is a compilation of 12 specific accusations that have been made against me publicly, primarily on social media, several by members of Congress. Next to each accusation, I have placed the full context of the statement being misrepresented, verified by public transcript. In every case, the misrepresentation is substantial. In 3 cases, the statement attributed to me does not appear in any public record of my words. She looked up from the documents. I do not know whether those making the accusations were working from bad information or were deliberately distorting my record, but I am prepared to address each accusation individually, with documentation if the committee would like to do that now. The offer hung in the chamber. A challenge, stated politely, backed by a folder full of evidence. Several senators exchanged glances. Senator Cantwell leaned back slightly. That will not be necessary at this juncture, Director-designate, though we may return to specific items later. Thank you, Senator, Tulsi said, and placed her hands back on the table and waited. In the gallery, AOC had gone very still, because she recognized what had just happened. Tulsi had not defended herself by arguing about policy. She had not gotten emotional. She had not appealed to her military service as a shield. She had brought documentation. Organized, pre-prepared, professionally compiled documentation that addressed specific accusations with specific evidence. This was not a politician's response. It was an investigator's response. And it meant that every attack AOC had helped coordinate and publicize over the past months had been anticipated, researched, and prepared for. The question that had begun forming in AOC's mind, quiet and uncomfortable, was, what else is in that folder? The answer came 3 hours into the hearing. The questioning had moved through intelligence oversight, through relationships with congressional committees, through budget priorities, through the role of the DNI in coordinating between the 16 agencies under its umbrella. Tulsi had answered everything with the same combination of technical fluency and unshakable calm. And then Senator Ron Wyden asked about political pressure on intelligence assessments. Director-designate, there have been concerns that the politicization of intelligence under previous administrations has compromised the integrity of assessments provided to policymakers. How do you intend to ensure that intelligence community assessments remain free from political influence? It was a sincere question from a senator with genuine concerns about institutional integrity, but it created an opening, and Tulsi had been waiting for exactly this kind of opening. Senator, I share your concern about the politicization of intelligence deeply. It is, in fact, one of the reasons I believe my background makes me suitable for this role. Let me explain what I mean. She settled slightly in her chair. The shift was barely perceptible but communicated a change of register, like a key change in music. I have spent 21 years in the military. In that time, I have operated in environments where the cost of acting on bad intelligence, or intelligence shaped by political pressure rather than reality, is measured in human lives. I have treated soldiers who were casualties of decisions made based on distorted assessments. I understand in a visceral and personal way what it means when intelligence is corrupted by politics. That is not an abstract institutional concern for me. It is something I have experienced. She paused, and then she said something that was quiet and precise, and that changed the temperature of the entire chamber. Senator, I would like to speak for a moment about what politically motivated attacks on intelligence professionals actually look like, because I have observed from the inside what happens when politicians use accusations of disloyalty or incompetence or foreign sympathy as weapons against people in the intelligence and national security community. And I have been on the receiving end of exactly those kinds of attacks. The silence in the chamber deepened. Some of those attacks have come from this building. Some of them have come from elected officials who have made public statements about me that are not based on evidence and that I believe they know are not based on evidence. She said it without anger, without drama, just as a fact being stated for the record. I want to be very direct about something because I think this committee deserves directness. I have been called a Russian asset by people who have never met me, who have never reviewed my full record, and who in some cases have publicly celebrated every military intervention that I, as a combat veteran, have questioned. I have been called dangerous to democracy by people who have used their platforms to coordinate social media attacks against a military officer's confirmation. And I have been accused of lacking integrity by people who have documented integrity problems of their own that have never received the same public scrutiny. The last sentence landed in the chamber like a stone dropped in still water, rings spreading outward in every direction. Senator Wyden blinked. Senator Burr leaned forward. In the gallery, AOC went completely rigid, because she knew, with the absolute certainty of someone who has studied power long enough to recognize when it is turning, that Tulsi Gabbard was about to say her name, and she could not stop it. She was in the gallery of a United States Senate hearing chamber. She was on camera. She was surrounded by journalists. She could not leave because leaving would create the clip of her fleeing. She could not speak because she was not a witness and had no standing to interject. She could not even visibly react because her face was being watched by two camera operators who had positioned themselves with a clear sightline to the gallery the moment she sat down, because everyone in that room had understood that she was the real story. She was trapped, and Tulsi Gabbard, who had spent 21 years learning how to identify and exploit tactical vulnerabilities, had known exactly where she was sitting and had planned accordingly. "The committee has heard a great deal," Tulsi continued, her voice remaining steady and professionally measured, "about concerns regarding my background and my fitness for this role. Those concerns have been amplified publicly by several elected officials. I respect the right of elected officials to raise concerns about presidential nominees. That is their constitutional function. However, I would submit to this committee that the credibility of those concerns must be evaluated in light of the credibility and the record of the people raising them." She reached into the folder again and withdrew a document with the unmistakable letterhead of the House Committee on Ethics. Let me speak about a specific example. On July 25th of 2025, the House Committee on Ethics released the findings of a 4-year investigation. That investigation examined the conduct of a sitting member of Congress in connection with her attendance at the Metropolitan Museum of Art Gala in September 2021. The committee found, after 4 years of investigation conducted by members of both parties, that this Congresswoman impermissibly accepted gifts in violation of House rules. The phrase settled into the chamber. A sentence from an official bipartisan congressional report, stated into the public record of a Senate confirmation hearing, in front of cameras transmitting to every major news network simultaneously. She paid less than half the market value for a custom designer gown. She received professional hair styling services for which she initially did not pay until threatened with legal action. She received professional makeup services that remained unpaid for months. She brought a guest whose ticket was not covered under any applicable House rule exception, and she received luxury hotel accommodations for which she did not fully reimburse until the investigation required it. Tulsi looked up from the document. The committee ordered her to pay an additional $2,983 to the vendors she had underpaid. The vendors she had underpaid, Senator, were working-class service providers, hair stylists, makeup artists, small business owners, people who provided services in good faith to a member of Congress and who were not fully compensated until a federal ethics investigation forced the payment. She placed the document on the table. "Now, this member of Congress has been one of the most vocal and public critics of my nomination. She has characterized me as dangerous and as lacking the integrity required for this role. I believe this committee and the American people deserve to consider that characterization in full context." In the gallery, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was experiencing something she had not experienced in her public life: the sensation of being entirely, completely without a script. Her communications director, seated 2 rows behind her, had his eyes fixed on the back of her head, waiting for any signal about what to do. There was nothing to do. There was no tweet that could address this. There was no press statement that could be issued fast enough to get ahead of it. Tulsi Gabbard was reading from a bipartisan ethics committee report in a Senate confirmation hearing on live television. The facts in that report were true. AOC knew they were true because she had lived through the 4-year investigation that produced them. She remembered the meetings with her legal team. She remembered the committee letters. She remembered the day her chief of staff had come in and quietly closed the door before telling her what the committee had found. She had thought that chapter was closed. She had thought the payment of $2,983 and the formal letter of admonishment had ended it. She had thought she could continue to hold the moral high ground because the committee had found no intentional wrongdoing. She had not anticipated that a woman being confirmed as Director of National Intelligence would walk into a Senate hearing room with the committee report in her hand and read it into the record, while AOC sat 18 feet above her with nowhere to go. Tulsi was not finished. The pattern I am describing, she continued, pulling another document from the folder, is not limited to a single event. I have also reviewed publicly available House disbursement records, which are available to any American citizen through the House of Representatives website, relating to this same member of Congress. In December of 2024, official congressional disbursement records, which document expenditures from taxpayer-funded member representational allowances, show payments of $3,700 described as dance training to an individual named Juan D. Gonzalez, and an additional $50 to an entity called Bombazo Dance Co., Inc., also described as dance-related expenses. These payments were listed as official congressional office expenditures, which means they were paid from the taxpayer-funded budget allocated to this member's congressional office. She looked up. When these payments were reported in the press, this member publicly stated, and I am quoting directly from her official social media post, 100% wrong. None of this is taxpayer money. This is an FEC filing. However, these payments did not appear in any Federal Election Commission filing. They appeared in the official House disbursement records for October through December of 2024. Those records are, by definition, taxpayer funds. She let the silence stretch for a full 4 seconds, so the committee is presented with a specific factual discrepancy. A member of Congress publicly stated that specific expenditures were not taxpayer money. Official government records show those expenditures in the taxpayer-funded member representational allowance. Both of those things cannot be true simultaneously. Additionally, investigative reporters attempting to verify these payments were unable to locate either the individual named Juan D. Gonzalez or the entity Bombazo Dance Co., Inc. in standard federal databases. Americans for Public Trust filed a formal ethics complaint alleging potential misuse of taxpayer funds. That complaint is currently under review. She stacked the documents neatly and placed them to her left. I raise these matters not as partisan attacks. The documents I have cited are bipartisan ethics committee findings and publicly available government disbursement records. Any American with internet access can verify every fact I have stated. I raise these matters because this committee is evaluating my fitness to lead America's intelligence community, based in significant part on concerns raised by this same member of Congress. And I believe that the integrity of those concerns must be evaluated against the documented record of the person raising them. Senator Burr stared at her for a long moment. He had chaired and participated in more confirmation hearings than he could count. He had never seen anything like this. He said, slowly and carefully, "Director-designate Gabbard, you are making very serious allegations about a sitting member of Congress by name." Tulsi met his gaze directly. "Senator, I have made no allegations. I have cited official documents that are publicly available and in the public record. The House Ethics Committee made findings. The House Disbursement Office published records. Americans for Public Trust filed a complaint. I have done nothing more than compile these existing public documents and present them in organized form. If the facts they contain are serious, that seriousness lies in the facts themselves and not in my presentation of them." The answer was airtight. Every senator in that room understood what had just happened. Tulsi had not attacked AOC with rhetoric. She had not made accusations. She had read official government documents into the hearing record, documents that were publicly available and verifiable, documents that had been produced by bipartisan processes, documents that AOC could not dispute because she had lived through the investigations that created them. In the gallery, one of the camera operators had quietly angled his lens to hold AOC's face in a sustained wide shot. He had been doing this for 10 minutes, because an editor at his network had called his earpiece and said, "Stay on her face, do not cut away." AOC's expression was controlled, professionally controlled, the way a person controls their expression when they know they are being watched and know that every micro-expression is being recorded and will be analyzed in slow motion by 10,000 people before the end of the day. But underneath the professional composure, anyone who had known her long enough could see what was happening. The calculative intelligence that had always animated her face, the quick-reading quality that made her good at rapid-fire social media and live television, That intelligence was currently running very fast through a very bad situation and finding no exits. Because there were no exits. She was watching her own political identity being systematically dismantled using the federal government's own documents, by a woman who had prepared for this moment with the discipline of someone who had spent 21 years training for high-pressure situations. And she was doing it in the single venue where AOC had the least power. AOC owned social media. She owned Instagram. She owned Twitter. She owned the progressive media ecosystem that had made her famous. But she did not own a Senate confirmation hearing. She did not have a mic. She did not have a platform. She had a seat in the gallery and a face that everyone in America was about to see in HD. Tulsi allowed the committee a moment to absorb what had been presented. Then she continued, and her voice shifted to something quieter and more personal. I want to speak briefly about what service means to me, because I think it is relevant to this committee's evaluation of my fitness for this role. In 2004, I was 23 years old. I deployed to Iraq with the Hawaii Army National Guard as part of a medical unit providing combat support. I served in a war zone. I treated wounded soldiers in conditions that are difficult to describe to people who have not experienced them. I held men whose injuries were catastrophic and whose lives depended on what I did in the next 60 seconds. I received the Combat Medical Badge, which is awarded to medical personnel who provide care under direct enemy fire. I earned that decoration in Iraq. I did not perform service for that decoration. I performed the service, and the decoration followed. She paused. I deployed again in 2008. I served as an officer in the Army Reserve for 21 years. I did this not because it was politically advantageous, but because I believe in service to this country as a genuine obligation and not as a brand. I have never staged a photograph at a military installation for Instagram. I have never used images of soldiers as backdrops for political content. I have never worn my service as a costume. I wore it because it is what I am. She looked at the senators directly. I am not asking this committee to confirm me because of my military service. I am asking to be evaluated on my record, my qualifications, my demonstrated commitment to the institutions I would be asked to lead. But I do ask that the committee weigh the credibility of the attacks against my integrity against the record of the people who have led those attacks. And I ask that we consider what kind of leadership America needs from its intelligence community. Someone who has spent 2 decades in uniform, who has operated in actual theaters of conflict, who understands the human cost of decisions made with bad intelligence or compromised assessments, or someone whose primary qualification for leading a political attack is the size of their social media following. The chamber was so quiet that the hum of the HVAC system was audible. Jake Tapper, watching from the press section, had stopped taking notes. He was simply watching, because he understood, as a journalist who had covered Washington for decades, that he was watching something that would be discussed for years. Not because of its drama, because of its discipline. Because Tulsi Gabbard had walked into a room full of people who expected her to be a punching bag, and had instead delivered a methodical, documented, thoroughly prepared evisceration of her most prominent critic, without raising her voice once, without making a single claim that was not backed by an official government document, and without ever appearing to be anything other than a senior military officer giving a briefing. That was the part that was impossible to spin. She had not attacked AOC. She had read official documents about AOC into the public record. And if those documents made AOC look hypocritical and ethically compromised, the fault lay not with Tulsi but with the 4 years of bipartisan congressional investigation that had produced those documents in the first place. The committee took a brief recess. In the hallway outside the gallery, AOC's communications director pulled her aside. They stood in a marble corridor with security personnel positioned discreetly at both ends. His voice was very low. "We need to get ahead of this. We need a statement out before the end of the recess." "What kind of statement?" she asked. Her voice was steady. She had trained herself over years of public life to keep her voice steady in moments of crisis. But her hands, he noticed, were clasped together in front of her with the white-knuckle grip of someone holding something very fragile. Something that says this was a politically motivated attack using the confirmation process as a weapon, that she exceeded her mandate, that she's using intelligence resources to target political opponents. AOC looked at him for a long moment. She will say she used only public documents because she did. He met her eyes, I know. He said it quietly, like a doctor delivering a diagnosis. She only used public documents. The statement AOC's office released during the recess was carefully worded. It called the presentation an unprecedented weaponization of the confirmation process against a sitting member of Congress. It accused Tulsi of exceeding her appropriate role as a nominee. It described the Ethics Committee findings as minor procedural matters that had been fully resolved. It did not dispute a single specific fact that Tulsi had presented, because there were no facts to dispute. They were all in the public record. Every journalist in the building had the documents in front of them within minutes of the statement's release, because Tulsi's team had pre-distributed copies to the press gallery, properly embargoed until the moment they were read into the hearing record. Every fact checked out. The Ethics Committee report was real. The disbursement records were real. The Americans for Public Trust complaint was real. The statement from AOC's office calling it a weaponization of the confirmation process crashed against the wall of those verifiable facts and slid to the floor. The recess lasted 18 minutes. When the committee reconvened, Tulsi returned to the witness table with exactly the same composure she had left it with. No visible anxiety. No indication that she was aware of the firestorm building outside the chamber. She simply sat down, poured a fresh glass of water, and waited. Senator Cantwell, who was clearly shaken but was a professional, addressed her carefully. Director-designate, your presentation of documents related to Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez has generated significant reaction. Do you want to say anything further on that subject before we continue? Tulsi considered the question for exactly 2 seconds. Senator, I said what needed to be said. I stand by every document I presented because every document is a public record. I am happy to move on to any other topic the committee wishes to explore. Senator Cantwell nodded. Then she asked about artificial intelligence and its implications for intelligence gathering, and Tulsi pivoted to the new topic with the same fluid competence she had shown on every other subject, as if the previous hour had been perfectly routine. That ability to pivot, to deliver a political torpedo, and then immediately move to discussing AI governance frameworks with evident expertise, was perhaps the most disorienting thing for the senators to observe, because it meant Tulsi had not come into this hearing primarily to destroy AOC. That had been, from her perspective, a secondary task. She had come to demonstrate her fitness for one of the most consequential roles in American national security, and she was demonstrating it. The combination was annihilating. In the gallery, AOC sat through the remaining 2 hours of the hearing. She could not leave. She had understood that the moment she sat down, leaving early would be the clip that defined her. Staying demonstrated that she could maintain her composure under pressure, which was the only positive interpretation available to her now. So she sat. She watched. She kept her face professionally controlled. And she thought about the tweet that had gone out the previous evening with 90,000 likes that called Tulsi Gabbard dangerous and lacking integrity. She thought about what those words looked like now, in the light of what had just happened. She thought about the 4-year investigation she had told herself was resolved and closed and behind her. She thought about the $2,983 in payments to vendors she had underpaid, the hair stylist who had threatened legal action, the makeup artist who had waited months, the documentation of a lifestyle that said one thing while a dress reading Tax the Rich said another. She had been so certain that the arc of the story was under her control. She had told that story so many times, across so many platforms with such consistency, that she had begun to mistake the performance for the reality. She had begun to believe that because millions of people accepted her self-presentation, the self-presentation was the truth. Tulsi Gabbard had just demonstrated, with official documents, in a setting where AOC had no ability to shape the narrative, that the performance and the reality were not the same, and the gap between them was official. It was bipartisan. It was in the public record. It could not be deleted or archived or replaced with a better clip. It was real. The hearing concluded at 4:17 in the afternoon. Tulsi rose from the witness table, collected her documents with precise movements, exchanged brief professional handshakes with the senators nearest her, and walked out of the chamber with the unhurried gait of someone who had completed a task to her own satisfaction. She did not look up at the gallery. She did not need to. AOC descended from the gallery into a gauntlet of journalists. She had prepared a brief statement, which she delivered with maintained composure, calling the hearing's direction unprecedented and calling for accountability around the use of confirmation processes as partisan weapons. The journalists listened to the statement. Then they asked about the Ethics Committee findings. Then they asked about the disbursement records. Then they asked about the dance training payments. AOC answered each question with practiced deflection. The committee found no intentional wrongdoing. These were complex gift reporting situations. These are minor accounting issues that have been corrected. The payments were legitimate office expenses. The characterization of them as taxpayer funds was a misrepresentation by politically motivated actors. Each answer sounded, in isolation, reasonable, but the journalists had the documents in front of them. And every time AOC said minor or corrected or no intentional wrongdoing, a journalist would read back a specific line from the Ethics Committee report or a specific figure from the disbursement records, and the answer would have to start over, deflecting a different specific fact. It went on for 23 minutes. By the end of it, 3 things were clear. 1. AOC could not dispute the facts Tulsi had presented because they were documented facts. 2. Her deflection strategy was visibly not working with the journalists in front of her. 3. She was very tired. She left through a side entrance with her communications director and 2 aides. The journalists watched her go. Then they turned to their phones and began filing stories. The social media reaction began within minutes of the first clips appearing online. The clips were devastating not because they were dramatic, but because they were not. Tulsi reading quietly from an ethics committee report in a steady professional voice was, in its refusal to be theatrical, more powerful than any performance could have been. A performance can be dismissed as theater. A woman reading calmly from an official bipartisan government document in a Senate hearing cannot. The most widely shared clip was not, as AOC's communications team had feared, the specific revelations about the ethics violations or the disbursement records. The most widely shared clip was the 23 seconds in which Tulsi described treating wounded soldiers under fire in Iraq and earning her combat medical badge. Because those 23 seconds, placed against the context of everything else that had been presented, crystallized something that millions of viewers felt simultaneously and immediately. The difference between someone who has actually sacrificed something for this country and someone who has built a career on the performance of sacrifice. The contrast was not stated. It did not need to be stated. The document stated it. The combat medical badge stated it. The bipartisan ethics committee report stated it. The disbursement record stated it. My combat medical badge cannot be bought at a Met Gala. Tulsi had not said those words in the hearing, but within 6 hours they were everywhere on social media, generated organically by users who had watched the hearing and independently arrived at the same formulation. The insight was too obvious, too true, and too economically expressed to not go viral. Veterans organizations began sharing the clips of Tulsi describing combat service. Veterans who had served alongside her began making public statements. The combat medical badge is not a decoration that is given lightly. I served in the same theater. I know what it takes. Watching a social media politician question the integrity of someone wearing that badge, and then watching that person respond with documented evidence of ethical violations, that sequence means something very specific to everyone who has worn a uniform. What it means is, you picked the wrong fight. For AOC, the 48 hours following the hearing were the worst of her political career. Not because of the immediate media coverage, though that was damaging. Not because of the congressional response, though that was sobering, but because of the silence from her own side. In her 6 years in Congress, AOC had developed a reliable coalition of progressive voices who would defend her in moments of attack. Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, Jamal Bowman, the broader squad orbit that had formed around their shared political brand and mutual reinforcement on social media. When the hearing clips began circulating, she waited for the statements of solidarity. They did not come. Ilhan Omar posted about an unrelated immigration issue. Rashida Tlaib was silent on social media for the first time in recent memory. Jamal Bowman issued a statement about education funding that did not mention AOC or the hearing. The DSA, which had already withdrawn its endorsement of AOC months earlier, said nothing. Not a word of support from the organizations or individuals who had built their public identities alongside hers. The silence was not accidental. Her communications director, in a brief and painful conversation that evening, told her what everyone in Washington already understood. Nobody wants to defend documented ethics violations. Nobody wants to be on camera saying the payments to unverifiable entities were legitimate office expenses when official records contradict that claim. Nobody wants to argue that the Ethics Committee findings were minor when the committee spent 4 years investigating and issued a formal letter of admonishment. And nobody wants to call Tulsi Gabbard's presentation a partisan attack when she used nothing but publicly available government documents. There is nothing to defend, he said quietly. We can attack the process. We can say she exceeded her mandate. We can argue that confirmation hearings should not be used this way. But we cannot defend the underlying facts because they are not defensible. AOC looked at him for a long moment. Then she asked, "What do we do?" He said, "We wait. We stay quiet. We let the news cycle move. We hope something else becomes the story." It was a withdrawal strategy, the political equivalent of turtling, pulling all vulnerable surfaces inward and waiting for the incoming fire to stop. It was not the response of someone with a strong defense. It was the response of someone who had realized, perhaps for the first time in their political career, that they were genuinely vulnerable, that the armor they had built out of social media presence and progressive brand and carefully managed narrative could not stop something as simple as an official document read into a Senate record by a woman who had done 21 years of actual work. In the days that followed, the investigation landscape around AOC expanded with the relentless logic of official processes that had been activated and could not be easily deactivated. The House Ethics Committee, which had formally closed its investigation with the letter of admonishment and the payment order, announced that it was reviewing whether the expanded public attention to its findings warranted any additional action regarding the payment compliance timeline. Americans for Public Trust, whose ethics complaint regarding the dance training disbursements had been pending, issued a statement noting that the public presentation of these issues in a Senate hearing had substantially raised the profile of their complaint, and that they were consulting with legal advisors about next steps, including potential criminal referrals to the Department of Justice. 3 separate government watchdog organizations, 2 of them nonpartisan and one self-described as progressive, jointly called for a comprehensive audit of all of AOC's congressional office expenditures since she took office in January 2019. The joint statement cited what they described as a documented pattern of compliance failures that warranted systematic review rather than case-by-case resolution. Each of these developments generated additional news coverage. Each news cycle of additional coverage brought the hearing clips back to the top of the social media algorithms. Each time the clips were circulated, more people watched them for the first time. The total view count across platforms passed 100 million within 72 hours, which was, by any measurement, one of the most widely viewed political events in recent American memory. The specific clip of Tulsi reading from the Ethics Committee report about the underpaid vendors, the hairstylist threatened with legal action, the makeup artist who waited months, that clip was accompanied on social media by a consistent and devastating refrain from users who were identifying as former AOC supporters. "I believed in her. I donated to her. I shared her content for 6 years. I thought she was one of us." The betrayal was not from the right. It was from the progressive base that had elevated her, because progressives believe deeply in worker rights and in holding the powerful accountable. And the image of a congresswoman wearing a dress that said tax the rich while underpaying working-class vendors and only paying them fully when an ethics investigation forced the issue was not a right-wing attack. It was a direct contradiction of the values her supporters had believed she embodied. Within 1 week, 3 progressive primary challengers had announced campaigns against her for her 2026 congressional race. All 3 were from her district. All three were credentialed community organizers with deep roots in the Bronx and Queens neighborhoods she represented. All three had the same basic message, stated in slightly different ways. We need a representative who does the work. We need someone who is here for the community and not for the camera. We need a congresswoman whose record matches her rhetoric. One of them was a public school teacher who had been active in the district for 15 years. One was a housing rights attorney who had won landmark cases for low-income tenants. One was a community health organizer who had built a network of clinics serving immigrant populations. All three were, by the standards of the progressive movement, exactly the kind of candidate that AOC had once been when she first ran in 2018, running against an incumbent who had forgotten that service was about the people you represent and not the platform you were building. The irony was precise and complete. The politician who had launched her career as the authentic outsider challenging an establishment incumbent was now the establishment incumbent being challenged by authentic outsiders. The story had inverted. The progressive champion had become the cautionary tale. In her district, the response was particularly sharp. Town halls that had once been celebrations of the AOC political identity became uncomfortable confrontational spaces where constituents demanded specific answers to specific questions, not answers about national policy, not answers about climate change or Medicare for all, answers about the $2,983, answers about who Juan D. Gonzalez was and why taxpayer money went to an entity that could not be verified in federal databases, answers about why it had taken the threat of legal action to fully pay a hairstylist, answers about why, in 6 years of congressional service, the district had not seen the kind of legislative achievement that the level of national attention and media presence would seem to promise. Why had the 14th District not seen more return from having one of the most famous members of Congress as its representative? That question had been asked quietly before. After the hearing, it was asked loudly. Because Tulsi had stated, with official data, that AOC's constituent service record was among the lowest in Congress, that her legislative record showed no major bills passed into law, that her district had some of the highest poverty rates in New York, and that the national celebrity platform had not translated into meaningful local progress. These were not new facts. Political observers had noted them for years. But they had never been stated on this kind of stage, with this kind of authority, by someone carrying official documentation. Now they were inescapable. The progressive media ecosystem that had once provided consistent positive coverage began to fracture. Some outlets maintained support, writing pieces about the dangers of using confirmation hearings to attack members of Congress and about the weaponization of official processes for partisan purposes. But even these pieces were forced to acknowledge, in their final paragraphs, that the underlying ethics findings were real and the underlying disbursement records were real, and that these matters deserved serious scrutiny regardless of the venue in which they were raised. Other progressive outlets took a harder line. Several explicitly acknowledged that the ethics violations were disqualifying, that a congresswoman who had underpaid working-class vendors while wearing a tax-the-rich designer gown had a legitimate credibility problem, that the disbursement records raised genuine questions that deserved genuine answers. The spectrum of progressive media opinion on AOC, which had previously ranged from enthusiastic support to mild critical praise, had shifted to something more complicated. The most honest pieces, written by progressive journalists who had covered her closely and who clearly felt genuine grief about what they were writing, said, "We believe this person represented a new kind of politics." The evidence suggests the new kind of politics had some very old-fashioned problems. For Tulsi Gabbard, the aftermath moved in a completely different direction. Her confirmation, which had been expected to face significant Democratic resistance, moved forward with less opposition than anticipated. The reason was not complicated. The documented presentation of her preparation, her command of intelligence community material, her ability to stay composed under the most unusual circumstances a confirmation hearing had ever produced, had demonstrated something that political opponents found difficult to argue against. She was qualified, she was prepared, and she had proven in the most public way possible that she would not be intimidated by political pressure. The intelligence community, whose career professionals had watched the hearing closely, responded with something approaching relief. An analyst who had worked in the community for 20 years told a reporter, "What we watched was someone who understands the difference between political theater and substantive work. Someone who does preparation. Someone who responds to attacks with evidence rather than rhetoric. Those qualities are exactly what you want in a director of national intelligence." The professionals in this community have spent years watching political appointees who understood PR better than intelligence. Watching someone who clearly understands both, and who under extraordinary pressure chose facts over performance, that was reassuring. Among veterans, the response was electric. The veterans community had been watching the attacks on Tulsi Gabbard for months with a particular kind of anger that comes from watching a combat veteran's service being dismissed by people who have never served. The hearing transformed that anger into something else: vindication. Dozens of veterans' organizations issued statements praising Tulsi's composure, her preparation, and specifically her defense of her combat service record against what they described as bad faith attacks from someone who had never worn a uniform. The combat medical badge is not a political prop. One veterans group statement read, "It is a decoration earned under fire." Watching its recipient respond to political attacks with documented evidence rather than emotional appeals showed exactly the character that decoration is meant to represent. Tulsi's approval numbers moved dramatically in the days following the hearing. Among all voters, her favorability increased 14 points. Among independents, it increased 22 points. Among Republicans, it increased 8 points. Among Democrats, a percentage that would have been unimaginable before the hearing, it increased 4 points, with the increase concentrated among moderate Democrats who cited her composure and preparation as factors. The most striking movement was among voters who described themselves as previously skeptical or strongly opposed to her nomination. A significant portion of that group, when polled after the hearing, said they had changed their view or substantially softened their opposition. The most common reason given: she had more integrity than her critics had claimed. She responded to attacks with evidence, not rhetoric. That is what I want from someone leading our intelligence agencies. 6 months after the hearing, the landscape had reorganized itself around what had happened in that chamber in ways that no one had fully anticipated. AOC remained in Congress. She had not resigned. She had not been removed. But the quality of her presence in Washington had changed in ways that were difficult to quantify but easy to observe. Her national fundraising had declined substantially, as donors who had previously given generously found the ethics cloud uncomfortable to associate with publicly. Her committee assignments had been quietly restructured, with her losing her seat on one of the higher-profile committees she had previously held. The squad, the political identity that had been central to her brand, had fractured. Not publicly, not dramatically, but in the quiet Washington way that happens when people stop returning calls and stop signing onto joint statements and start giving interviews where they discuss their own individual policy priorities without mentioning colleagues they were previously inseparable from. Her social media presence, which had once been her greatest strategic asset, had changed character. The engagement remained high, but its nature had shifted. The ratio of positive to critical responses had inverted. Hostile comments now regularly outnumbered supportive ones on major posts. The algorithm, which rewards engagement of any kind, continued to show her content to large audiences, but the audiences were no longer primarily composed of enthusiastic supporters. They included a significant proportion of critics who had arrived at her pages specifically to challenge her, to share the hearing clips, to ask about the ethics violations, to compare her statements about working-class advocacy to the documented record of underpaying working-class vendors. Her Instagram, which had once been a masterclass in controlled narrative, had become a contested space she no longer fully controlled. She had always known that social media was a platform where you could shape your story. What she had not fully understood until now was the degree to which that shaping power depended on your story being broadly accepted as true. Once significant doubt about the story was introduced, supported by official documents and verified by journalists, the same platform that had amplified her narrative began amplifying the doubt. The technology was neutral. It amplified what generated engagement, and documented evidence of hypocrisy presented in the context of the hearing generated enormous engagement. Town halls in the 14th District had always been part of her brand. She was famous for them. Accessible, passionate, willing to take hard questions, speaking the language of the community with the authenticity of someone who had actually grown up in it. After the hearing, the town halls changed. The questions changed. Not all of them. Many constituents still showed up with genuine support, with gratitude for her work on climate and health care and immigration, with loyalty to the political project she represented. But a significant portion of the questions were about the hearing, about the ethics violations, about the disbursements, about what she had actually accomplished legislatively, about why the district's poverty rate had not changed significantly during her tenure, about why having the most famous member of Congress had not translated into more federal investment in the communities she represented. These were fair questions. They had always been fair questions. The hearing had given people permission to ask them loudly and publicly in a way that the previous social media bubble had made socially complicated. You did not challenge AOC at a town hall before the hearing. You were part of the team or you were the enemy. After the hearing, the team dynamic had cracked. The sense of shared political identity that had made her events feel like rallies rather than constituent meetings had softened. They felt now more like the actual constituent meetings that congressional town halls are supposed to be, which meant they were harder, which meant she had to answer harder questions without the protective shield of uncritical enthusiasm that had surrounded her for 6 years. She was learning in public what governance actually requires when the performance stops working. The 3 primary challengers continued building their campaigns. Their fundraising numbers were competitive. Their local organizing was deep and serious. The housing rights attorney had developed a particularly detailed policy platform focused on the specific challenges facing low-income tenants in the district, a platform grounded in years of actual legal work on actual cases with actual outcomes. It was the kind of platform that was easy to contrast with the kind of national policy advocacy that generates millions of social media impressions, but does not directly help a family facing eviction in Hunts Point. AOC's team knew the primary was genuinely competitive in a way that her previous primary challenges had not been. The 2020 primary had been more of a nuisance than a threat. The 2022 primary had been a formality. This time it was different. This time there were 3 serious challengers with serious community roots and a serious message that resonated with serious urgency, because the hearing had made it impossible to dismiss. The era of the magic shield was over. The shield had been the conviction, held widely in progressive circles, that AOC was an authentically transformative figure whose commitment to the values she proclaimed was genuine, and whose record, despite whatever minor procedural issues might arise, was fundamentally aligned with those values. The hearing had cracked that conviction. The Ethics Committee report had existed before the hearing. The disbursement records had existed before the hearing. Americans for Public Trust had filed its complaint before the hearing. These things had all been in the public domain, but they had existed in the public domain in the way that many uncomfortable facts about popular figures exist, known by people who were looking for them, visible to the critical, but not centrally present in the minds of the millions of followers who consumed her content and believed in the story she was telling. Tulsi Gabbard had taken those existing facts, organized them into a coherent documented presentation, and read them into the record of a Senate confirmation hearing watched by millions of people who had never previously been confronted with them in this organized, verified, authoritative form. She had not created new information. She had illuminated existing information in a light so bright that it could no longer be unseen. That was the nature of what had happened, not a political attack, an illumination, conducted with a combat veteran's precision, a lawyer's command of evidence, and a 21-year public servant's complete indifference to being liked by the people she was holding accountable. Because people who have treated wounded soldiers under fire in Iraq have recalibrated their definitions of what counts as a difficult situation. A congressional hearing, however high the stakes, however intense the media coverage, however uncomfortable the testimony, was not a difficult situation by the standards that Tulsi Gabbard had established for herself across 2 decades of actual service. It was, by those standards, a controlled environment with known variables and documented evidence, and an opponent who had made the fundamental error of attacking a prepared warrior with nothing but rhetoric. The lesson that resonated across Washington in the months after the hearing was both simple and significant. Preparation matters. Evidence matters. Character is revealed not by what you say about yourself, but by how you conduct yourself when the cameras find you in a situation you did not script. The politician who had built an empire on scripted moments, on perfectly timed social media, on manufactured emotional beats and viral clips, had met a situation she could not script. And the politician who had never particularly cared about being scripted had been there with documentation, with composure, and with a combat medical badge that represented something no amount of Instagram presence could approximate. The hearing became a case study. Political science professors assigned it. Media analysis programs examined it. Operatives from both parties studied what Tulsi had done and why it had worked. The consensus was not complicated. She had done the work before she arrived. She had brought receipts. She had stayed calm. She had never once been drawn into emotional combat, never once raised her voice, never once allowed her opponent to make the moment about feelings rather than facts. She had fought the kind of fight that a combat veteran fights, not the kind that looks dramatic in the moment but achieves nothing. The kind that is planned, prepared, executed with precision, and produces a clear and permanent result. 12 months after the hearing, a photograph circulated widely that was taken at an unrelated congressional event. It showed AOC seated at a hearing table, looking diminished in a way that was difficult to articulate but immediately recognizable to anyone who had followed her career. In the background of the photograph, barely visible but unmistakable in dress uniform, was Tulsi Gabbard standing in conversation with a group of senators, her posture carrying the ease of someone who had arrived somewhere she belonged. The photograph circulated with a caption that users generated organically, without coordination, in virtually identical form across dozens of platforms. It said, simply, "Performance and substance." 2 words, 11 characters. A complete description of everything that had happened between these 2 women in that hearing room on that February morning, when a combat veteran with a folder full of public documents had walked into a room and shown America the difference between saying you believe in something and actually living it. If you have watched this far, you have witnessed something that Washington rarely produces. Genuine accountability delivered with genuine evidence by someone with genuine authority earned through genuine sacrifice. Smash that like button if you believe politicians should face this level of scrutiny regardless of their party or their social media following. Subscribe to this channel right now because we are committed to bringing you the stories that show what real leadership looks like when it stands next to performance and refuses to pretend they are the same thing. Share this everywhere before the algorithm buries it. Comment below and tell us what you think. Should every congressional ethics investigation be read into the public record the way Tulsi read it at that hearing? Should members of Congress who attack nominees face equal scrutiny of their own records? What does this story tell us about what we actually value in our leaders versus what we say we value? Turn on notifications because the story of authentic service versus performed activism is not over. It is just beginning. This story proves something that America has always known, but sometimes needs to be reminded of. A uniform cannot be bought. A combat medical badge cannot be manufactured. A record of actual service to actual people in actual danger cannot be faked. And when performance meets substance in a room with no scripts and no algorithms and nothing but documented facts and the weight of 2 decades of different kinds of service, there is never any real question about which one wins. Substance wins. It always wins. It just sometimes takes longer than it should for the lights to be bright enough for everyone to see it. Tulsi Gabbard made the lights bright, and in that light, everything that needed to be seen was seen. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had attacked someone she thought she understood. She had studied the media version, the contested record, the selectively quoted statements, the caricature that political opponents build and political allies defend. She had never studied the actual person. The person who had sat in actual danger and remained calm. The person who had done actual preparation for an actual confrontation. The person who had understood, with the tactical instincts of 21 years in uniform, that the most devastating response to theatrical attack is not theatrical counterattack, but documented, calm, irrefutable truth. She made one catastrophic mistake. She brought performance to a fight that had already been decided by substance. And America watched the result in real time. God bless the men and women who serve this country in uniform and understand that service is not a brand. God bless every person who has learned the hard way that receipts outlast rhetoric. And God bless anyone watching who decides today that the standard we hold our leaders to should be the standard of what they have actually done, not the standard of what they have said about themselves in the most flattering possible light. The era of performance politics has a document attached to it now. It lives in the public record of a Senate confirmation hearing. And it reads, in the flat, neutral language of official government documentation, as a story about the distance between who we perform ourselves to be and who we actually are. That distance, in the end, is the only thing that matters, and it cannot be closed with a tweet.